We are all together again, friends, for this next episode of the Juicebox Podcast. Brian is the father of a young child with type 1 diabetes who was diagnosed a few years ago around Thanksgiving. He was anxious in the beginning of the diagnosis, and so Brian sought out therapy, which was helpful for him. We're going to talk about that and much more. Nothing you hear on the Juicebox Podcast should be considered advice, medical or otherwise. Always consult a physician before making any changes to your healthcare plan. Don't forget, if you're a U.S. resident who has type 1 or is the caregiver of someone with type 1, visit t1dexchange.org/juicebox right now and complete that survey. It will take you 10 minutes to complete the survey, and that effort alone will help to move type 1 diabetes research forward. It will cost you nothing to help. The holidays are coming up fast. Head to CozyEarth.com. Use the offer code JUICEBOX at checkout to save 40% off of everything they sell. CozyEarth.com. Use the offer code JUICEBOX to save 40% this holiday season. If you're newly diagnosed, check out the Bold Beginnings series. Find it at juiceboxpodcast.com up in the menu, in the featured tab of the private Facebook group, or go into the audio app you're listening in right now and search for Juicebox Podcast Bold Beginnings. I'm having an on-body vibe alert. This episode of the Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by Eversense 365, the only one-year wear CGM. That's one insertion and one CGM a year. One CGM, 1 year. Not every 10 or 14 days. EversenseCGM.com/juicebox. Having an easy-to-use and accurate blood glucose meter is just one click away. ContourNext.com/juicebox. That's right. Today's episode is sponsored by the Contour NextGen blood glucose meter. Your kids mean everything to you, and you do anything for them, especially if they're at risk. So when it comes to type 1 diabetes, screen it like you mean it. Because if even just one person in your family has type 1, your child is up to 15 times more likely to get it. But just one blood test can help you spot it early. So don't wait. Talk to your doctor about screening. Tap now or visit screenfortype1.com to get more info and screen it like you mean it.
Hi, Scott. My name is Brian. I'm glad to be here speaking with you today after listening to you for what seems like hours on end every day for a long time. So glad we finally meet.
Oh, it's very nice to meet you too, Brian. What's a long time? How long have you been listening?
You might find this a little humorous. So 2 Thanksgivings ago is when my son was diagnosed. I got a little packet that included actually to your Arden's Day blog. And I remember looking at that blog saying, what am I going to learn from a guy who stopped blogging 10 years ago? Or, it was some outdated looking site that they sent me to.
Right.
And by January, though, about a month and a half later, I actually found your podcast. I'm like, oh, this is where he moved to. And I've basically been listening almost every day since, starting from the beginning. So it's been over a year listening almost every day. It's helped me get through a lot. So I appreciate what you do.
That's lovely. I'm also thinking that the ardensday.com/blog doesn't exist. Hold on a second. What did you find?
It was a printout. The thing was ancient looking. It had, I just remember like, what was it? Yeah, they sent me to the blog and I was like, this doesn't look like it's been updated in a while.
Because ardensday.com forwards to juiceboxpodcast.com.
Yeah, I don't, like I said, it was a picture of you and it listed the blog. And I remember typing in what it was. So, well, it was almost, I literally said to myself, well, what am I going to learn from this guy? He stopped talking about his, anecdotes and how to work his way through things, a while ago. And I was like, I guess he gave up, but you didn't. You just moved mediums. So glad I found it regardless.
I loved blogging. But this is what that is without all the typing and editing. But it's much better.
I agree. Yeah, it's much easier to consume. You can do 2 things at once while listening.
You have type 1 or your child? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's my son. He's 10. He was diagnosed when he was just after he turned 8.
Was this literally on Thanksgiving or around Thanksgiving?
I guess diagnosis story is as good as any, right? My family came to town from a couple different states for Thanksgiving. I used to love hosting Thanksgiving. It's a bit of a traumatic process now. I'm sure it's still something we have to figure out how to work around. But the family had come to town, and my one of my in-laws, my brother-in-law, actually has type 2. And type 2 that's not particularly well controlled would be something of an understatement.
Hi to him, by the way. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, and he's so well-meaning. He's so great. But, there's definitely some denial about, how he has to manage. So they were down for Thanksgiving. And my experience with him is actually what tipped me off to my son's diagnosis. So he drove down from where he was coming from a couple hours away. He ended up crashing the car. It sounds terrible, but it was like trying to get into a parking lot and like clip the curb. And so he's going to disable the vehicle.
Okay.
But he called us at like 2 a.m. the day before Thanksgiving. We're like, Jimmy, like, where'd you go? And he's like, oh, I'm here. So I went and picked him up. And I pick him up and he's just like chugging water and juice the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
Like, are you all right? Are you really thirsty? He's like, oh, it was a long drive. I'm like, all right. Well, let's get home, get you settled. And we got a long day of cooking tomorrow. Well, the next day, it ended up being that my mother even noticed it, that my son and he were kind of like queuing up to use the bathroom all day long. Mm. And I was like, what? That's a little unusual, but whatever. We didn't think too much more of it. Well, the next day, my brother-in-law, he was in such bad shape that he had trouble standing up. And the EMTs had to come. And he did a blood sugar test and the meter reader was high. Like they're like, hey, this one caps out at 500. I'm like, oh. And I didn't almost know anything at that point really about type 1 or type 2. I just understood the glucose values were something out of range for sure. So he ended up going to the hospital and they ended up treating him and a couple of days, insulin drip, the whole thing, and releasing him. So he was able to join us for Thanksgiving, but it was obviously this kind of pale on the whole day. And it occurred to me that, something might be off with my son, but I didn't know what it was at the time. And that night he wets the bed. And I think back, I said, wow, this is like the third time in 2 weeks. And it's like, this can't be right. This isn't someone gets sick and, wetting the bed isn't a symptom of being sick in the classical, like I got an infection,
right?
Like a cold or something like that. I said, this doesn't sit right with me. So especially after my brother-in-law's experience. And so I drove to CVS at 24-hour one at like 5:30 in the morning and bought a.
From the very beginning, your kids mean everything to you. That means you do anything for them, especially if they're at risk. So when it comes to type 1 diabetes, screen it like you mean it. Now, up to 90% of type 1 diagnoses have no family history. But if you have a family history, you are up to 15 times more likely to develop type 1. Screen it like you mean it because type 1 diabetes can develop at any age. And once you get results, you can get prepared for your child's future. So screen it like you mean it. Type 1 starts long before there are symptoms, but one blood test could help you spot it early before they need insulin and could lower the risk of serious complications like diabetic ketoacidosis or DKA. Talk to your doctor about how to screen for type 1 diabetes because the more you know, the more you can do. So don't wait. Tap now or visit screenedfortype1.com to learn more. Again, that's screenedfortype1.com and screen it like you mean it. ContourNext.com/juicebox. That's the link you'll use to find out more about the Contour NextGen blood glucose meter. When you get there, there's a little bit at the top. You can click right on blood glucose monitoring. I'll do it with you. Go to meters, click on any of the meters. I'll click on the NextGen, and you're going to get more information. It's easy to use and highly accurate. Smart Light provides a simple understanding of your blood glucose levels. And of course, with second chance sampling technology, you can save money with fewer wasted test strips. As if all of that wasn't enough, the Contour NextGen also has a compatible app for an easy way to share and see your blood glucose results. ContourNext.com/juicebox. And if you scroll down at that link, you're going to see things like a buy now button. You could register your meter after you purchase it. Or what is this? Download a coupon. Oh, receive a free Contour NextGen blood glucose meter. Do tell. ContourNext.com/juicebox. Head over there now. Get the same accurate and reliable meter that we use.
Glucose tester. And I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't know what strips went with which device, completely fumbling around. And just bought 2 of each. I was like, well, the 2 of these have to go together somehow. So I came back and I woke up my wife. I said, look, whatever you do, don't let anybody eat or drink anything while I figure this out. And she said, why? What's wrong? I said, well, I want to rule something out because I'd done what everyone does probably at some point. They WebMD something. And sure enough, you put in the bedwetting and the thirst, and it's, one of the top symptoms. That morning, we sat around the kitchen table and I tested myself first. It was like 79, and then went to my wife, same kind of thing in the 80s. And then I went to my son. It was 250. And I was like, oh God, what do I do here? And my wife said, no, it's got to be broken. Test again and test the other kids. So we tested everybody like 2 or 3 times, and his kept coming back in the mid 200s. And I kind of walked around the corner and broke down because I knew right then and there what it was, just given the symptoms and the scenario. And yet I called the pediatrician's office, and she said, oh, well, it could be an anomaly. You should just head to the ER and rule it out. And I was like, rule it out? I'm pretty sure we just ruled it in. Are you sure about that?
Just tested everybody 33 times. I spent $197 in test strips.
Oh my God. Those things. Yeah. It was like, I think I spent $200 in the morning. I bought 2 different machines with $100 of test strips each because they only sold the massive packs or whatever. And I was like, no, I'm pretty sure that's what it is. And so that morning we fed him, and then a lot of people might cringe. I said, well, let's have some breakfast before we go. And he had a bowl of cereal and a glass of orange juice. And then facepalm, now that I know that, we just sent him to the moon on the way to the ER. So we went to the ER and we told him, I said, we're here for type 1 diabetes admission. And somehow between that moment at the window and the intake nurse, someone put him in as type 2. Now my son is almost 5 feet tall. Well, back then, 4.5 feet tall, skinny 8-year-old kid. Like, doesn't quite fit the description. I know we're not trying to put everyone in a type there, but didn't really fit what it might have expected. And so the intake nurse does another finger prick, and he's like 575. It's like, oh God, what did I just do? And I'm looking at him. I'm like, you feel all right? He's like, yeah, why? I don't understand, but I know this isn't good.
Yeah. You caught it really early.
We did.
Yeah.
It turns out, because the flip side of that was he only spent about 3 weeks on regular MBI injections. We kept having to titrate down over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. Because for me, the horrific part, and you were actually one of the first people to respond to me, luckily enough, when I joined the Facebook group, was I said, I'm sitting outside my son's school every morning because I'm freaking out that he's going to crash low. And that's what would happen. We give him his food, his insulin, and within an hour, he's in the basement. And the nurse has got him downing 35, 40, 50 grams of carbs, and we can barely get him above 80. And it turned out that the honeymoon kicked in pretty quickly after the initial insulin. And we were just overdoing it. Like, give a kid who's insulin sensitive and unit and a half, and, we're fighting. So he spent 3 hours a day in the nurse's office for the first 2 weeks of school. It's like this. I literally said to myself, I don't know how anybody does this. This is insanity. Mm-hmm. Like, what is going on? And so finally we met with our endo, 2 weeks later. And she's like, well, I'm glad you've been bringing down his insulin dosing. That's been smart. And we got to the point where we just couldn't give him anything. It would just tank him. And we spent almost 10 months without him needing regular injections at all. The endos were confused initially, thinking maybe Modi or something else, but we just caught his diagnosis probably within the first 3-4 weeks.
Yeah. And then he had a really slow onset.
He did. And when we had his antibody testing done, they did it right at intake. We didn't get the results for almost a month. He only had 1 antibody against zinc. And I was like, okay, so maybe he doesn't have a normal onset. And sure enough, now we've gone through multiple antibody testing. Now he's up at 3, and we're on much more steady, but still inconsistent honeymoon-based treatment. So,
like Pokemon, he's collecting them all.
Yeah.
I'm going to get all the antibodies before I'm done. Oh my gosh. Well, how many other kids?
Oh, this is what you'll like. I have 4 total. So it's a busy house.
Are you done? Or,
I'm done. Yeah. I told my wife, have as many kids as you want. I'm here for you.
Oh, who did she have them with?
No,
it was you.
Me.
Oh, I see.
I was just telling her, I said, you're in charge of how many you want. Like, my father's 1 to 10.
Holy hell, really?
Yeah. I grew up with 45 first cousins. I mean, Christmas and Easter and all that stuff was always a massive house full of people. Easily 100 plus people would come to every family event.
Wow. You Irish?
Yeah, Irish Catholic. My dad married another Irish Catholic woman. So,
how many Michaels are you directly related to?
That's a great question. probably at least 7 at this point.
I'd say this as much as I can. My wife's father's name is Michael. He had a son. He named him Michael. That man had a son and named him Michael. His daughter married a guy named Michael. They had a son. They named him Michael.
Well, one of my in-laws, same kind of thing. They had a Michael and then a Michael, and even the middle names were similar. So the abbreviations are almost identical. And he's like, but I don't want him to be a junior. I'm like, well, it's pretty close to being a junior. You're just off by a letter.
You're all juniors. So listen, this is the most distasteful joke, but when Arden was born, they asked us if we had names for the babies. And I said in front of my wife's family, to them, not just in front of them, by the way, I directed this statement to them. I said, if it's a boy, we're going to name him Michael, we love dad more than you, and then our last name. And everybody got so pissed. But I always just think that's what, I mean, isn't that what you're doing? Aren't you just like, isn't it brown nosing? I mean, I don't know.
Oh, well, so after our first was born, we chose some family names because we were frankly struggling with what else to do.
Yeah.
We're like, well, and my father's point was, oh, that's a very political choice of you. I'm like, what?
Oh, I agree with him.
We took one name from one side of the family and another name from the other side of the family and just kept doing that with all of our kids. And it was just because their names were familiar to us, though. We weren't trying to earn family brownie points or anything, but that's the way certain people took it. And you're like, that was very good of you.
Yeah.
Way to honor the family.
Nah, people get mad at anything. Kelly and I did the exact opposite. We took when she was pregnant both times, we grabbed this big fat baby name book. Now a book, as you may know, is a grouping of paper, like bound together so that you can see words. And we would sit down every night, like after work, and we would I would read out loud a few pages of the book. And we would just go through the A's, we kept going, and we would just circle any names we liked. And then we went back, and then you'd be surprised a couple weeks later, you'd go through and you're like, who put Aiden on here? No, like that kind of stuff. Like, and eventually we just got down to Cole. We're going to name him Cole. And then we did the same thing with Arden. And when people ask, like, who are they named after? We always say, like, I don't think I'm related to anybody, like, worthy of naming another person after. Not that I know of. But anyway, all those Michaels out there making the world a better place. So these other 3 kids, any chance they have antibodies? Have you tested them?
We haven't tested them. There's some reluctance there. I mean, literally, I think we were home from the hospital maybe a couple days when Tzield was announced by the FDA as being cleared. Mm-hmm. My wife and I were like, well, what do we do? Because if this really does delay onset and some of the other kids have the antibodies, is that something we're willing to put them through? And then, there's Facebook groups out there that have people who've gone through it. And it seems hit or miss too. And so we've not put our heads in the sand per se. We're definitely aware of what's possible. Yeah. And likely in some cases. And you'll like this just as a stat. The reason why I juggle with it is, they'll tell you, oh, if a family member has type 1, you're at 10 times increased risk of getting it yourself. And then somewhere else higher up in the statement about type 1 diabetes, will say, and 90% of people who are diagnosed have no family history. Like, not really sure how those two stats go together. Where a vast majority of people don't have it relative, and then yet you tell them we're at this massive increased risk. So
I think they're making those numbers up. I also think I've heard people say 10% and 10 times. And I just think they don't know which they were told. Like, I mean, and where does that number even come from? Back to that 10%, 10 times. I've heard 5%, 5 times. I mean, if there's data on it, great. Like, but I mean, at what point are we just repeating something we heard someone else say? I mean, what I can tell you is that very frequently there are other autoimmune issues in the family. That's a fairly frequent thing. I mean, I'll ask you, are there other autoimmune issues in your family? You guys got to have celiac, right?
No. So that's been the interesting experience. So little tangent on that is my mother is like a self-taught amateur genealogist.
Okay.
So she ended up being, for a while there, probably like a top 20 contributor to Ancestry.com, helping people put ancestry together. She traveled around
the
country. She went to all the crap Mormons get. They have the best records. My mother would go out to Salt Lake all the time for church marriage records and that sort of thing. She'd come down near where I am to the National Archives, same kind of thing. She flew to Europe a few times. So her experience was to document family trees for a lot of people. And so when my wife and I actually were married, she actually went back across my family through my mother, my father, my wife's mother, my wife's father, as far as she could find records. In 2 cases, they go back fairly far, probably almost 400 years in 2 family cases.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, Mom, after my son's diagnosis, who in the family has autoimmune or even more appropriately type 1? And I knew instantly after I asked the question who she was thinking of. So one of her second cousins, I suppose, which is really truly like once removed kind of scenario, both her kids have type 1. So we had to go almost 2.5 family generations away to find a family tree component, a branch, if you will, that had type 1 in it. And that was just by sheer luck that we knew that, and we were engaged with them and we talked with them.
This episode of the Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by the Eversense 365. Get 365 days of comfortable wear without having to change a sensor. When you think of a continuous glucose monitor, you think of a CGM that lasts 10 or 14 days. But the Eversense 365, it lives up to its name, lasting 365 days. That's 1 year without having to change your CGM. With the Eversense 365, you can count on comfort and consistency 365 days a year. Because the Eversense silicone-based adhesive is designed for your skin to be gentle and to allow you to take the transmitter on and off to enjoy your shower, a trip to the pool, or an activity where you don't want your CGM on your body. If you're looking for comfort, accuracy, and a 1-year wear, you are looking for Eversense 365. Go to eversensecgm.com/juicebox to learn more. I still find that to be close in my approximation, though. I think if we went and found a bunch of people who don't have any autoimmune stuff, like none, and I think it would be harder for you to find a connection in their family. And this is me, again, doing what everybody else is doing. I'm just guessing based on the things I've heard. I don't actually know anything.
We have other issues in the family, I suppose, that we're not really clear as to what occurred, perhaps. Mm-hmm. I had an uncle who passed very young when he was in his 30s from a rare form of juvenile brain cancer, which at the time it happened, everyone's like, we don't understand. This cancer develops in like 2-year-olds to 4-year-olds. And here's a 35-year-old man with it. Like, how does that happen? And so there's family as big as my father's, you're bound to run into people who have challenges across the board.
Well, I mean, by the time you get to your 10th, you're probably using some beat up sperm to make babies with, I would think. That's seriously, 10 kids.
They were in construction too. So, well, my mother once said, so my father was right in the middle. My mother once said after my grandmother stopped having children, you're actually a pretty skinny woman. Not trying to be offensive,
but nobody knew because she was always pregnant.
Yeah, 23 years, right? It was like a child every other year for 23 years.
Wow.
So my oldest cousins and my youngest cousins, I think there's almost a 40-year gap now.
Boy, that's something.
Now everyone's like, so who's an uncle and who's a cousin and who's a niece or a nephew? It's like impossible to tell.
Did they have a lot of longevity? Or are a lot of them alive?
Yeah, most of them are.
Wow. That's pretty cool.
A bunch of my aunts and uncles made it into their eldest now in their late 70s, actually early 80s. God, now that I think about it.
So you could have an uncle in their early 80s that has a brother or sister in their 60s.
Yeah.
Wow. Jeez. All right. So when the diagnosis happens, what's the reaction in your family? Because you listed here in your notes to me that you'd like to talk about family reactions, and you said it was pretty far ranging. So what did you see and how did it impact you?
Yeah, that was an interesting one for me. It kind of put me into therapy in a good way. I mean, I needed to process what was going on, and I'd never done that personally. And so for me, I was shook pretty hard, and I dove into it the only way I knew how, which was, as my therapist said to me, you have this illusion of control, which is a very real symptom for people. And, he said to me, Brian, you made it 40 plus years with the idea that you were in control of anything. Mm-hmm. And this changed all of that, because kids used to say, oh, you're Dr. Daddy. Why? Well, because I caught a lot of things. So for example, kid had pneumonia. We were struggling to figure out what it was. I watched the doctor diagnose it. And I said, all right, I need a stethoscope. So I have a stethoscope. I need a pulse ox. I got that too. And they're like, well, why are you doing it? I said, well, I have 4 kids. And when we have problems, every time I come to pediatrician's office or, urgent care, you guys do the same, 6 or 7 tests every time to, help establish a baseline. I said, I can do that at home and be better directed. So I used to have this idea that I could, more or less figure it out. And then everything was always an acute issue, right? Type 1 being a chronic, lifelong thing. It was a total loop for me. And I accepted it by buying books. So I bought most of the books everyone in the Facebook group shares and others, maybe not so much. And I threw myself into reading. So you were laughing that you're not much of a reader, perhaps, but I'm a history major. So for me to pass history and get a major in it, I read thousands of pages of books a semester, if not weekly. So for me, reading was really easy to go through. So I ripped through a lot of the books, management, the science of it, and I was accepting of it. And as much as my wife is currently today involved and engaged, she was a bit in denial, actually a lot in denial that what occurred, especially after he rolled off insulin after that first month. It was kind of it wasn't the whole idea of he's healed. It was more of his body is doing something on its own here. Let's not overthink it and just take every day as it came. So, I was doing the crazy man thing, which is planning for the future. She was doing the rational thing, which was just do every step 1 foot in front of the other. And if today doesn't need insulin, today doesn't need insulin. So those reactions were very wide ranging. And then same with my kids. My son's reaction, he used to get chronic ear infections. I have my whole theory as to that was part of the problem, is that he was always inflamed from various foods that he would eat that he doesn't eat now, that none of us eat now. Stuff like fried foods, seed oil, for example. I don't mind if it's butter and that sort of thing, but we took him off all that and he no longer gets ear infections, but he was good for 2 or 3 a year, easy. His response at diagnosis was, laying on the ER table, getting his first 2 injections was, well, so how long do I have to do this? 10 days? Because he was thinking, amoxicillin, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And the nurse kind of looked at me like, I don't know how to respond to that. He's asking how long he has to do these injections. And I kind of looked at him. I said, well, only thing I could think of at the moment was for as long as you need to until they're secure. And we'll just do it every day as it happens. That was one of these. He looked at me and goes, well, what does that mean? I said, well, for a while. And it could be years. I don't know. But for right now, it's going to be every day. And he cried for maybe 30 seconds and then moved on. I mean, the kid is resilient. That's, again, reactionary, being pod changes don't bother him. Sensor changes don't bother him. He did his own injections. I don't know how he did it. It used to scare the crap out of me. Am I doing it right or wrong? And that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then my eldest daughter, Dad, you're so upset all the time. Why? You're so sad. And I was like, well, because your brother's facing this. And she goes, yeah, but he's not doing anything any different. So here's another child observing that, really grateful for that. She doesn't want to treat him any differently. She doesn't treat him like he's a glass object ready to break at any moment. She still beats up on him. Not that I enjoy that, but again, another reaction. And my youngest, he's also got another sibling that's really close. So back to your thing about parenting, my 2 middle kids are 13 months apart. So one was born in summer, and then for Christmas, my wife dropped a pregnancy test in the stocking, said, surprise, well, we got one in diapers, followed by another one in diapers 9 months later.
And your dad's like, you're not going fast enough.
Pick up the pace. So yeah, there's only 6 years between our 4 kids. So it's a pretty tight grouping.
Oh, wow.
But
okay.
My youngest was just she was kind of quiet about the whole thing, in awe. And she wanted to know how she could help, little 5-year-old girl at the time looking at her big brother. So it was just really interesting to see how no one really wanted to treat him differently, but I was trying to throw a protective bubble wrap around him. And it ended up being not the wrong thing at the moment. It was for me. It wasn't so much for him. Right. I guess that's the best way to put it.
You're still trying to figure out a way to stop all this and be in control of it.
Right. Yeah. And so I realized, I just can't. And so one of your favorite sayings has helped me a lot, which it's interesting to see a lot of the static thinking in the healthcare setting, because we go to Large Children's National Hospital. And one of the original bigwigs in pediatric endocrinology runs the practice, and we've not ever met with that endo, but I came up with all our basal settings. I came up with all of our bolus settings, our insulin to carb ratio, sensitivity, all that stuff, because listening to you mainly and the podcast and all your contributors like Jenny, that sort of thing, the books as well. And I was like, well, meet the need, right? And so, right now, while he's honeymooning, some people may be pulling their hair out. I've just had to roll with it. He needed 4.5 units yesterday, and I think he's already up to 4.5 units today. Like, I can't tell you why. It's not like it's a major change in his food intake. It's just some days it's like, whoa, dial back the basal and dial back the amount we give him at mealtime.
Yeah.
And other times it's like, whoa, we didn't even put a dent in this. Like, what on earth is going on? So I've learned to just let go and let it happen and respond to it, because you'll drive yourself absolutely crazy into therapy like I did, trying to figure it out.
I hope when I say that, I hope people like take it the way I mean it, because I always worry that when I say meet the need, that it feels like an increase statement, but it could be a decrease statement. It could be whatever the need is, just meet it. Don't overthink it. Don't go, I don't understand. Why is it less today? Why is it who cares? Just match the need with the resistance of insulin that's required and move on. It's so weird. Like when you said a second ago, you're like, there's this saying you have that helps me. And then you kind of went into your story. It's so interesting to see what strikes certain people and how it ends up helping them.
Oh, it does.
Yeah.
So I'm in my analogy that matches up with that is, so I'm in sales and high-tech software selling to enterprise and government. And
that history degree really came in handy.
When people ask me, what do you do with a history degree? I'm like, I don't know, whatever you want. I sold shoes at Nordstrom's when I was, in college to help pay for it. Afterwards, I was like, well, what do I do with this? Went to go work on Capitol Hill. And they don't pay anything, by the way. People who are dedicated on the Hill, they're not doing it for the money. At least the members might be, but the people who work for them, definitely not. Mm-hmm. So I moved here to do that, and then decided to be in software sales because I understood technology well. I'd love to tinker. I got in trouble with the FBI one time.
Wait, hold on. You got in trouble with the FBI one time?
So the Digital Millennium Copyright Act was just passed when I was in college, and I was doing, you remember Napster? Wow, we're going back.
Yeah, of course.
There was alternatives to that for video and media and other things, software, et cetera. And this was, gosh, we're going to go off on a tangent here. So my best friend's father was an intellectual property lawyer. And I'll never forget, after I graduated and this whole thing with the FBI stopped and whatever. And he said, your generation was right to be angry at the music industry. And I was like, that's not why I did it. It was free. I was confused. I'm like, I wasn't thinking about it, but he's making the point. Why spend $22 on an album to listen to one song? Kind of felt like a ripoff. And that's where the iTunes thing took off. The FBI thing was because I was sharing huge volumes of pirated movies that had been ripped off of Hollywood studios by insiders in Hollywood.
You set up a server?
Yeah. I was one of the biggest sharing groups in the US at the time. It wasn't me personally. It was a group of us in a fraternity that I then went and hacked the school network, took all the firewall rules off and all the other fun stuff that stopped us from sharing. And I kind of had personal control of the network. This was the early days of a lot of cybersecurity. It wasn't very good. So yeah. I had fun with it. And, we'd literally that night, I'd be like, what do you guys want to watch? Right. And we'd go download something before dinner and come back, and by 9:00, whatever movie anyone wanted to watch, we downloaded it. And so that ended up being a problem for me because the FBI traced my IP address back to the school. And then from the school, they figured out where it was coming from. They sent this massive letter. It actually went home too. And that's where my father was like, he wanted to kill me. You're going to risk everything. I said, well, I laughed. I said, they didn't catch me for like 99.9% of the stuff. They found like an Adobe installer file or something, completely innocent, like literally none of the stolen stuff. It was just and when I say stolen stuff, I mean like the pirated stuff that people were sharing. It was a legitimate file that I'd actually saved in the wrong file.
How about that?
Like upgrading it. I'm like, oh, well, okay, yeah, sure. I'll delete that file. And from there forward, I never did it ever again. It was one of these, wow, that was a close brush with reality.
And just stopped. Was it like a cease and desist and you just ceased and desist?
Exactly right.
Yeah. It's funny, people like nowadays, I don't even think going to the movies doesn't have the same vibe as it used to, obviously. Like you're talking about sharing films that weren't even released yet or were literally in a theater. And young people listening don't understand. Like a movie would come out in June. It would stay in the theater for 6 months. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's not like right now a movie comes out in a movie theater and like 3 weeks later you can watch it on like Max or something like that. It wasn't like that. So you were in their mind stealing millions of dollars from them if you were making it free, but you're lucky you didn't go down for that.
Well, here's the I don't know, the funny part of the whole thing is most of these movies were actually taken from the studios themselves by employees because you'd get their screener discs. So if people have never seen Oscars from a while ago, the Oscar discs that they'd send out, anytime they wanted a vote for a given actor or actress, at least this is what I was told back then. So this could have evolved since then, but the disc itself for the scene they wanted someone to be nominated for, and these were always in the movie screeners that we downloaded, at the bottom it would scroll for your consideration in big block white lettering. Mm-hmm. And everybody was like, what's that for? I'm like, the guys at Paramount or the guys at whatever thought this was the scene the actor should win Best Picture for. Right. And people are like, wait, isn't this in the theaters now? I'm like, yeah, they're already pushing like who should be nominated for something, and the Oscars aren't for 6 months.
Right.
So the part for me that I was like, look, this is just one big circle. Like the studios are not paying their people well enough. They're not protecting their own property well enough. It's all being shared freely. I don't know what you're supposed to do. And, I was a kid and it was like, hey, I just type in a word and I find the movie and I download it. Like there's no limit, right? Same thing with the music.
And you're not making money off it. It's all swagger, right? It's all just because I can.
Yeah. And it was all one of these things where it was all built on the idea of the more shares you have, peer-to-peer networking took off, right? And that's where the whole process just was, the more you share, the more you had access to, and the more people downloaded from you, the higher your rating. It was like Facebook before Facebook. How many shares do you have? And so likes,
yeah.
that's he's a good source of material. And, just
that was that. But isn't that crazy? No kidding.
So I turned that somehow into a sales career.
and well, I see I see the through points, and they let you graduate. The school didn't make too big. Oh, no kidding.
Well, the school understood what we were doing, and we weren't by any means any violator anywhere. It was happening all around the country. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, everyone figured out how to shut it down. They went after the people who created the platforms, which is what they always do. They don't go after the users. They go after the dealers, right? The dealers are the guys that made the tech, like the guys that founded Napster and these other products. They said, you got to stop doing that. It's making it too easy for piracy. Mm-hmm. I mean, I knew deep down at the end of the day, I said, this really isn't wrong, but it's so easy. So what are you going to do? But it taught me a lot about how to talk to people around the technology, because people wouldn't understand. Like, how did you do this? And I realized it was just a series of stepping stones. Right? You just had to start questioning and start doing and start dabbling. And then you'd build on that experience. So it put me in the mindset of technology has to be conquered one step at a time. You don't become an instant expert, just like with what you do. I mean, I look at you and the way you talk about management, and I said, my God, he's so confident, clear. He knows what he's doing, why he's doing it. And if it doesn't go as planned, it doesn't bother him. And I was like, that's the 10,000 hour rule, mm-hmm. which in the technology world, a lot of people know it, which is you're an expert after 10,000 hours. You can't really learn a whole lot more.
Yeah, my secret to how I think about diabetes is that I don't think about it any differently than I think about anything else. Like I run my life the way I run diabetes. So I learn things. Once I know they're right, I do them. I never look back. I never question things once they work. And, if something goes wrong, you just wipe the slate clean and start over again. Like there's no reason to beat yourself up. There's no reason to overthink something that's been thought through a million different times. Like this is how insulin works. Just use it like that. And if something goes wrong, there's a variable at play. You can look back later and try to find it if you want. But in the moment passes. And so now you're in a new moment. Just go back to doing things the right way again. And it just works. Like everything works. Like I'm going to say something incredibly inflammatory. Life is really easy if you let it be. Most of the time. Like where it gets difficult is when you bring other people into it, because they have their perspectives and ideas and what's important to them. And when that doesn't mesh with you, that's where things become, that's where they say, relationships are difficult. Right, because you have a way of thinking and somebody else has a way of thinking, and now you're trying to coexist without pissing the other one off too much. But if you just kind of put yourself in a white room with diabetes, you get your settings right, your pre-bolus, your meals, you pay attention to implications like fat, protein, exercise. You stay flexible, you meet the need. You don't argue too much about why what's happening is happening. If you get stuck on that, you get stuck forever. It's like stepping in a tar pit, you know. Now you're here having this argument that there's no answer to forever and ever and ever. So just don't step in it. Just go past it. And it sounds like that. It's funny because the way you talked about going through the technology and figuring out the peer-to-peer and the whole bigger idea, like that's really very similar. The only place you got stuck so far, it sounds like, is in the unreasonable idea that you could somehow impact this for your son in a way that's beyond, you know, what the natural world will allow. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I view myself happier today than I did when I used to tell people I don't have a care in the world. Like I used to look back the summer before the diagnosis, or really 3 months prior to that.
Mm-hmm.
One of the businesses I was in, it's part of the reason why you do high risk startups is private equity came in and bought the business, and hey, like that's a nice little lump of change. Let's have a little vacation. So we took 2 weeks to go to the beach, something we wanted to do as a family for a while, and we did it. And I remember thinking, literally, I'm like, oh, life can't get any better than this, and blah, blah, blah. But I was still always on edge with, kids still learning to swim. 2 youngest were still learning to swim. Around the pool, I could not relax. Lots of other components, like we'd go skiing. I grew up skiing in New England, teaching them to ski. It's like, oh my God, they're going to careen off the trail and hit a tree. Like literally, my mind would always race to the worst possible outcome of whatever the enjoyable event I was supposed to have.
Mm-hmm.
Like the wave's going to take him out at the beach and sweep him out. I'd have to go save him. So I was never really capable of just letting go. And then once the diagnosis happened, I was like, I can't live like this. I have to let go and just let, to your point, life happen. Just go with it.
So there's nothing wrong, in my opinion, there's nothing wrong with being prepared for those ideas. It's being stuck in them that's the problem.
Yes, I was certainly stuck in them.
Yeah,
that was my problem.
I was having this conversation once with my brother-in-law, and I said, wait a minute. I said, you have a 2-story house. And he goes, yeah. I said, you don't know which window you'd jump out of if there was a fire and you couldn't get down the stairs? And he goes, what? And I said, one of your windows is a lesser of evils. You don't know which one it is? And he goes, no. And I said, I do. I plan for stuff like that. He goes, you plan for what you'll do if your house catches fire and you can't get down the stairs. And I was like, I mean, plan's a strong word. I gave it 20 seconds of thought. I know which window I'd go to. Yes. I
mean, I had the little roll-away ladder tucked under your arm as you walked into the second story.
Well, that's my problem. In my mind, having the ladder is a bridge too far. but knowing which one goes to a little rooftop that would let me like kind of tumble down on the ground and probably not break anything or put me in a position where I could make it longer till somebody got there. Like, it's not a thing I've ever thought about since then, but I did think about it for 4 seconds. I'm freaked out when none of you think about anything. I'm also freaked out when you can't stop thinking about it. Like, I understand the kids don't swim. We're going to the beach, so we're going to pay attention. But after I've had the thought, then I execute it. I don't worry about it. Like, that's where like worry is a waste of imagination comes into my mind. You are genuinely making up a story about a thing that very likely won't happen. And then you're guarding against it. So do you have anxiety?
I don't anymore.
But you did.
Most certainly did.
You gave it away for your son.
I did. Yeah. I had to be able to enjoy life. I had to let him feel that it wasn't a barrier to him. And if he's watching his father constantly worry over every little thing, he's going to wonder, is there something I need to be worried about?
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is, we're starting to transition some of his care to him, and he's gotten better with it. But like, I didn't want him to see the anxiety that was very obviously on my face. Like, I was not eating well. I lost a ton of weight. When I say a ton, it's not like I had a huge amount to lose, but I probably lost 30 pounds in 2.5 months because I had to force myself to eat. Like, I was just so anxious.
Mm-hmm.
And my wife one day was like, get a hold of yourself. And I was like, yeah, I need to. Well,
I'm not laughing. I'm just trying to imagine if I told my wife to get a hold of herself, what would happen?
Well, it was warranted because...
Oh, no. It would be warranted if I said it to my wife, too. I'm just wondering what would happen if I said it.
Oh, that's true. Like, no.
You got a hold of yourself. My wife would beat me with a stick and then leave me and take everything. Get a hold of yourself.
That's why I said the reactions were so helpful. Like, I overdid it and she kind of underdid it, right? And we both had to get to our balance and where we were both at peace with, like, hey, like, I'm accepting of it.
Did you both find level? Did she rise up and you came down?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. And she's still probably calmer about the whole thing than I am.
Well, in fairness, Brian, you're worrying about it. Why do two of you have to worry about it?
Well, no, you know what? That's probably a fair way to look at it.
Yeah.
We settled into that role a little bit. Like we still haven't been able to use any of the automation stuff because like every day would be different. It's just not.
You're not up to automation yet.
Yeah, okay. We're thinking at some point we'll be able to, but his needs are just too highly variable still. So I'm the automation. That's me.
Okay.
But I enjoy it because I look at it from your perspective, which is if I can better begin to see the patterns that are there. Maybe some of them are imagined and I just lucked out. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, I take it the way you look at it, which is, it's very real in most cases. And I'm not tinkering with settings. It's more about responding in the moment to what's going on. But that process, she's slowly coming around to. Like I told her, hey, listen to Scott. And I gave her the Bold Beginnings and Pro Tip series. I said, listen through all of these and we'll be able to have a better conversation about what we're doing.
Did she do that?
She did.
Did it help?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Completely understands now. Like yesterday, my son, we went to watch her boating day, I guess was yesterday, right? Tuesday. So a bunch of schools were closed. So I took my son to have her, he went to go watch her play a tennis match. And at the end of it, he's like, Dad, I want a cheeseburger. And I was like, I kind of was rolling my eyes a little bit. I'm like, these fat bombs and just like, whatever, screw it. Let's go ahead. So we went and had a cheeseburger and, it's this giant thing. I was like, God, I don't even know what the carb count is on that. So I said, we have to wing it. We have to eyeball it and we have to be ready to respond. And I let him make the judgment call. What do you think that is? And thankfully, he did it on his own. I didn't do this at all. He's, I guess, to your point, like Arden, he overestimates it, not by a lot, not where I'd go, oh, no. But he does more than I do. And I'm like, all right, let's go for it. I think he was only above like 180 for maybe 30 minutes. But of course, it came back 3 hours later. There was that rise again. And my wife said, the fat rise and the protein's going on. Like, we need to knock it down. I didn't even see it. She saw it before I did. Mm-hmm. And I was like, we would not have been able to have that conversation earlier on. She'd have been like, I don't understand what's happening. What do we do? And there'd been freezing paralysis. And we'd watch it probably keep going up.
Also, then there's an assumption you did something wrong because if she doesn't know enough about it to understand that other impact, then the idea is, well, you guys just didn't bolus well for this. And that's the thing that people forget you and your wife, but people get frozen that if they don't know the other implications, then they just go to, I did something wrong. And sometimes people shut down. You know what I mean? Instead of not everybody lurches forward. Some people just go, oh, I suck at this. And they kind of collapse. And then they sit with their 300 blood sugar forever.
Yeah. I had that conversation with our nurse practitioner that we see more than we see the endo. And at one back and forth over they use a lot of electronic communication for the easy stuff. I said, hey, I'm trying to dial in his ratio and I made this change. And she's kind of like, well, why'd you do that? I said, well, if I give him this much, he drops too far. This is how we ended up getting on a pump we have to do things in 1/10 of a unit on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. Because trying to keep a tighter range, you just, for his insulin sensitivity, like even a half unit will move him 80, I'll move him like 80 points.
Yeah.
So if he's at like 130, I'm like, so we did this for a while. I'm like, all right, Rory, go grab your favorite, whatever ice cream, sugary thing. It was like the idea you gave, you'd bolus for a juice box before sports. Like that way, if it doesn't work, you just down the juice. So we were always trying to match how much we could kind of catch it before it would drop, knowing that it would help bring him down, but not all the way down. Mm-hmm. So we were doing this feed the insulin thing. I'm like, this is insanity. He doesn't need to eat an extra 500, 600 calories a day in mainly carbohydrates and glucose related stuff, just so that I can bring him down to a number I'd like to see him at.
Yeah.
And she's like, well, okay, I see your point. I said, so can we get the Omnipod, please? She's like, all right, you clearly have comfort level with this that most people don't. So yeah, and we had it like 3 days later, but that was after a lot of trial and error.
Yeah.
And that was my first experience of trying to figure these things out on my own. I said, first confidence boost. Right?
I think for sure, when you are trying to make small adjustments like that, MDI is harder. Like it's just, you can't get as fine with the amounts, and there's more poking. And did you think your wife just didn't want him to have a pump, or she just didn't feel like she knew enough about it right away? Like, so she saw your comfort with it and thought, okay, that's fine.
There was some level of resistance to the idea. But then when I explained to her that, when he has like his favorite breakfast, he has eggs and these 2 Kodiak waffles that he loves. Like a unit ends up being a little too much, and half units not nearly enough. So we were doing like split bolus and constantly just trying to figure this out. I said, hey, imagine we do this now with an extended bolus and we split the ratios, and then now he's not 225 going into school at 8:30 because the bolus still hadn't hit from the second one, and and so it took this whole process, and she wrapped her head around the idea of, if you don't like his number going above a certain number, not that we need to make a number good or bad, but just what are we shooting for target wise? It's easier given his dosage needs to do it with a pump. And then when my son figured out that he only needs to put it on every 3 days, he's like, oh, I'm in. That was it. I'm in.
Okay.
Because, he'd do 6 or 7 injections, maybe 8 a day, just, with everything he ate. And it didn't bother him, but he was kind of like, it's such a production. Like, lift up the shirt, bob the area, soap, grab the pen, prep the pen. Like, he was doing all of that because he would actually tell us, Mom, I can insert it without any pain. You leave me be. And I was like, oh, okay. So he's ready for this. Let's see about a pump.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty great, actually. Hey, I've decided on what I'm going to call your episode, and it's I'm going to name it after the book I'm reading right now.
Well, that sounds fun.
And as a history major, I feel like you're going to know what I'm reading. It's called Meditations.
I don't know that book.
Oh, it's a collection of Marcus Aurelius's writings.
Oh, that sounds fun.
Yeah.
I actually have a book called Hubris sitting on my desk, which is all about kind of the pomp and circumstances that lead up to war and why wars typically don't go the way that people who start them think. And there's some Roman battles in that book as well, I believe. Yeah, I haven't read it yet.
Apparently, he used to sit down at the end of the day and just write down random thoughts, and they're all collected in this book called Meditations. So, and I feel like this is what we're doing with you right now. Like, I feel like we're just hearing about the things that at the end of the day, you were like, this is my takeaway from today. I'm going to build on tomorrow with this. And I don't know. Anyway, that's my inclination.
I like it.
Yeah.
I've my father used to quote the Beatles to me about that, which is life is what happens to you while you're making other plans. I think that's roughly the quote. He was a Beatles fan, not me, but I was always making lots of other plans. This obviously was not in it. I don't think type 1's in anybody's plans, but that never really resonated with me until after this. And actually going all the way back to one of your earlier questions about how people responded, my parents, when I called them from the hospital room, I said, Rory has type 1. My father's response was, oh, everything will be all fine. And it took me about 2 weeks, but I called him back after. I said, that's the absolute wrong response I needed from you at that time. I needed someone to empathize with me, sympathize with me, just be present in that raw emotion of it sucks. It probably feels really shitty right now. And that's what's going to happen for a while. And I didn't get that. And that's where I was really grasping. So my heart goes out to all the newly diagnosed on a regular basis. And those are really generally the people I almost always respond to on the Facebook group, which is, I've been in your shoes. It does suck, but just a little longer on this component. My favorite podcast episode of yours is when it's titled, I think, The Time I Decided to Share. That put me at ease when I first heard it, because it puts the Scott today and the Scott of when you were not really newly diagnosed, but about as far back as you would share. Those two pictures of you, it's kind of like newly diagnosed Scott struggled too, right? Like it's no secret, but it's, we're so far along in your podcast. I think some of that gets lost on people, but I was like, yeah, there's some really big gems in the background that you can say, hey, if Scott can be who he is today and Arden can be the woman she is today with this for 20 years, so can I, why can't I? Like, I'm listening to this person basically talk like an expert, but it didn't start there. No one starts there.
And maybe I can let go of some of the angst that exists during the process too. I would hope people can do that a little bit. Like, just, I mean, not that the feelings aren't real, but that you don't have to live in them for so long, that you can go, you know what, this is probably going to pass. I have to tell you, my favorite Beatles song that's a message from a title is Let It Be. I find that like a chant almost when I listen to it. Just, there's so many things that happen and they all seem so important and you feel like there's something to do all the time. But the truth is that most of the time, the best thing to do is nothing. Just let it be. I take a lot of comfort out of that usually. Yeah.
It's a good point. It's something occasionally I get a little jumpy on corrections and my wife will look at me and she'll kind of say, hey, can you give it one or two more, Dexcom readings, see if this is really a trend. And I would say probably 80% of the time, she's right. She's a good governor on the process for me, because otherwise I'm like, ooh, overdid that. And then I got a text, hey, cut the basal back. And like, we got to make up for a little aggressive overcorrection. So she's a good governor on the let it be part too, which is sometimes you got to let the decision you made play out and not second guess yourself, because then you'll just drive yourself crazy.
Yeah, sometimes you need to see the process happen. It's not so much about controlling the number as it is seeing what your impacts did so that you can make better decisions. And I mean, listen, I've had, back when I would, texting Arden when she was younger, I'd be like 10 basal increase, 30% for an hour. And then 5 minutes later, I'd be like, shut that off. And then
I do that all the time. Well, not to him directly, but when he's home, I'm always like, oh God, I'll walk, back into the bedroom 10 minutes later, back, well, don't need that temp basal.
Temp basal the other way now. What? We went too far. Do 10%, but for 45 minutes now. And like, it's fun to joke about because it felt like such like these wild overcorrections. But I'm telling you, the experiences were important. Like, I'm telling you, like, to see it happen now it allows me in present day to say, I don't like this 170 blood sugar, but I see what's happened in the past here with this, the algorithms pushed insulin or we bolused or something. And I'm reasonably sure that this 170 is going to be 90 in an hour. So I want to put more insulin in because of the number, but I got to trust the process, and I can trust it because in the past I've not trusted it and then I've learned from it. So I think it's all important, but in the end, when you get to your Zen place, and this is not just about diabetes, you sincerely apply this to your personal relationships, your jobs, how you feel about people, driving in traffic. Often the best thing to do is nothing. I mean, if you can leave with more than that today, you've done really well. But most of the time, you're just you. What's the cooking saying, right? Like you touched it too many times and now it sucks or something like that. Like, I forget what that idea is. Like, just stop fiddling with it so much. Let it be what it is. I don't know. I find that people get upset. I think if you just walked away from this and never thought about it again, it would go away. But instead, we're going to spend the next 6 months being mad about this, So anyway, I run my life on some very basic ideas. I run diabetes on my basic life ideas. Most of the time things go well. Am I perfect? I'm not. Do people all agree with it? They don't. You know what I mean? But it's working pretty well. Arden's alive. She's thriving. I just talked to her last night on FaceTime. She's at the end of her quarter. She's about to finish her sophomore year in college. She's sitting in a lab with a friend she made who somehow has diabetes, like the first in-person. My daughter made her first in-person friend with diabetes in her life when she was 20 years old at college. And wow. She's never once known a person with type 1 personally in person. She has one online friend and one in-person friend who has diabetes. And they're working together. And they FaceTimed last night because they got an extension on something. And they seemed like very happy for a minute. So I think they FaceTimed to be like, we got an extension. and they're so relaxed and laughing. But yet in the past week, they've both done all-nighters 3 nights in a row. Nobody's had like a crazy low blood sugar. They're managing themselves. It's nice. You know what I mean? Like, so I don't begrudge you your drill downs and your over involves. And I'm really impressed at how you let them go. I'm sure plenty of people are like, how did he just let go of that anxiety? I'm going to assume you went to therapy. Is that how you did it?
Yeah, I did it with therapy. They were things that I had to accept because the therapist would say to me that a lot of the anxiety was really a reflection of probably things that I had to acknowledge when I were younger. And so, I mean, I had to have a conversation with my parents. I said, is there a trauma in my background that I don't know about? I mean, I had to be very serious about that. And I thought, no, I have no idea what you're talking about. At the end of the day, there was maybe not so little things, but they definitely had an impact on me as a young kid that it kind of had me put up walls around certain things that I hadn't really faced down. And through therapy, it was one of these, look, there's ways that you can respond to certain pressures in life and just have to make that choice. And I'd been making the wrong one, essentially, very guarding. And I had to face them head on. So for me, a lot of it was I had to be more upfront with what I was actually feeling. So I think to your credit, in some ways, like, not that you don't have a filter, but you don't. Like you're speaking your mind and you're very clear about that. I think there's a lot of people who don't like to speak their mind because they're afraid they're going to upset somebody, when in reality, there's something you're trying to work through. And there's maybe a communication gap between you and the other person. And someone might take offense, but there are ways that you can learn to talk about them and say, look, this isn't me being offensive. This is me having an honest conversation about what I'm experiencing, what I'm feeling. And I hadn't really done that.
Were you mad at your parents for something? Because your reaction to your father was angry.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. The reaction with that is he's an on again, off again alcoholic.
Oh.
And so when I say that, it's he realizes that he's a much better person when he doesn't drink. And he's atrocious when he does. And not physically at all. It's verbal. It's terribly verbal abuse. In more of the attempt to be funny, that's the painful part of the whole thing. It was not mean to be mean. It wasn't saying anything vicious, but it was just barbs and jabs that you're like, you wouldn't say that if you hadn't been drinking. And I noticed this, and I said, at the end of the day, the people who should, in your mind, love you most and not say those things are saying them. Like I had to square up with that. And there was experiences as a kid where that was like something you'd see at the dinner table when the family would get together, is who can be wittier than the other person. And it almost invariably devolved into people picking at each other. Oh, yeah, the full roast. Like, could you imagine what Tom Brady just went through in this Netflix thing? Like,
oh, it's fantastic. I loved it.
I was like, wow, you really have to be open-minded about doing that. But imagine that instead of those being comedians hired to pick at you, it's your closest friends and family. And suddenly that may not feel so good. So yeah, roasting constantly, and it would cross the line a lot. I never acknowledged that bothered me immensely because I'm married into a family that doesn't do that at all.
Oh, those people.
They treat family, those people, very differently. And you can be lighthearted, but like there's things you just like.
Listen, I love humor. You can't be lighthearted and humorous. It has to hurt or it's not funny. And your point is you don't need your dad doing that to you. Right?
Your Jersey's through. I'm from Northern Jersey originally, so like I'm definitely familiar with the Jersey approach to stuff, New York City feel. But it was. But for me, it was one of these things where he didn't drink for 20 years. Like I didn't know he had this problem until after I was grown.
Oh, no kidding! Your dad hid drinking from you through your first 20 years of your life?
He didn't hide it. He quit cold turkey.
Oh, he stopped for that long.
I had no idea. My father was he'd go to a party and I just knew my dad as he'd have a Coke on ice. That was all he'd ever drink.
Your dad was white knuckling it through his whole life?
With this, for sure.
No kidding. How about that?
And then after my brother and I moved out of the house, I think he realized for whatever reason that he thought he could, ease his way into it. And nope. So he's done the rehab thing twice. And it hurts now because he's got grandkids. I'm like, do you want to spend a lot of time with them or not? Like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, what motivations you need not to pick up the drink because you can't stop. So for me, it was facing that down. And people may say, oh, I have problems in my life too, and I face it down all the time. But like for me, it was an unaddressed issue that if you idolize somebody and they're your rock because you saw them operate a certain way for 20 years and then suddenly they're vulnerable, they're a mess, they're all these other things. It's like, well, my anchor point just flew off. Like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do now.
Right.
The person who I would have expected to drive down and, stay at the house with us for a little while, you would never trust them to operate a vehicle.
We have family members our kids have never been in a car with. And we told them, you can't drive our kids. So don't ever, if it ever falls that way, just know that you're not allowed to drive my kids somewhere, no matter what. And we had to say that when we were pretty young to somebody. It was hard.
Yeah.
But again, I don't really have trouble saying stuff like that to people. So
no.
Yeah.
And as it should be though, that's the thing that I had to do is I had to learn to take the governors off on the hard feelings.
Yeah.
Again, not to insult somebody or hurt them, but to make sure that I wasn't left in this anxiety-ridden ball of, what if.
Mm-hmm.
And that freaked me up because the other option was medicate myself. And I talked to a few friends who'd done that. And they're like, it feels like you're driving somebody else's body. It's really weird. It works. The anxiety goes away, but they didn't, in their experience, think that going the SSRI route and others was worth it to them.
Mm-hmm.
I got a prescription, looked at it on my desk and said, if I go down this route and it works, I'm going to think that that's what I need my whole life. I want to try addressing the other underlying issues first and see if that works. Because if nothing works, then, hey, maybe I do need it. I'm not judging at all. If you need it, you need it.
Yeah.
But I decided that I would go the other way with it. And for me, it was what summarizes it up is I used to come home every day from work and then I'd say, all right, made it through another day. The kids are a little bit older. And I used to say to myself, well, at some point, they'll all be old enough where it's not stressful. So I used to kind of do that to myself. I was like, because we had so many young kids, under the age of 6 or 7. So for a long time, everything was, I've been to the ER on the same day with 2 different kids for 2 different injuries. Mm-hmm. With the same ER doctor looking at me like, would you forget something? I'm like, nope, here for a different reason, different kid. That was kind of the chaos in the house.
Were you finding problems that didn't exist? I thought to ask you this earlier and I never did.
No, I never found a problem that didn't exist.
Okay.
If it was an ear infection, it was an ear infection. If it was, pneumonia, it was pneumonia. The flu, that kind of thing. So I never invented issues. Mm-hmm. But that day of the ER trip, a friend of ours had given us one of these little sticker books for little kids. And my one daughter left it open and my youngest, who was 2 at the time, put the stickers in her mouth. And they were these kind of hard plastic foil back things that, God, so my wife she hears her gag and she's like, what the hell? So she's swooping out and she thinks she's choking on it. And we're like, how many stickers were there? And we're like, we have no idea. So we have, at this point, we're operating with the idea that maybe she swallowed one. And I'm like, well, if it's sticker made of paper or plastic, no big deal. But these were hard. We were thinking this might be able to puncture something. Yeah, or get stuck. So we drove to the ER and the ER doc was listening. There was no whistling. And he's no, but we'll do a chest x-ray. Because he's like, these things will light up on a x-ray machine, no problem, because they're made with some foil lining. It all came back clear. So in order to celebrate we dodged whatever, we went to the local park and we're working on my older 2 daughters' bike riding skills. And my second daughter wanted to try riding around the park with one of the training wheels off, following her big sister. And I rode with them. Hey, hit the brake. Oh, slow it down. We did this 5 or 6 times. And then the 7th time, I was like, sit down, relax. They got it. I sat down and I watched her. And she's my speed demon, risk taker 1. No braking. She keeps picking up speed. I'm like, oh my God. She tries to make a turn, goes right over the handlebars, nearly hits a big post, goes down hard, and I hear crying. So I run to the other side of the field and her arm is bent at a 35-degree angle. There's no bone sticking out, but you can very clearly tell it's broken. So the day that was supposed to be relaxing for me, after the chaos
2
of the
different
morning,
x-rays.
right, go back. And the ER doc's like, oh, you forget something. You were just here 3 hours ago. I'm like, no. And I show him the arm. He's like, what the hell? So, of course,
buddy, I told you there's no sticker in the kid. What is wrong with you? No, different kid, different problem. Hold on a second.
Exactly. And the look on his face was shock. Oh, you're serious. Mm. And then they had to do the standard thing with Child Protective Services, not because they were worried about us, but it was one of these
they do, yeah.
Kids on a bike and were you wearing a helmet? And so they did all that stuff. And that kid's tough too. All my kids are tough, but she never really was in too much pain throughout. And then if you've never seen a kid on ketamine that have a bone breaks set. It makes their eyes kind of go screwy. And I looked at my wife and said, I can't stay here for this while they set the brake. You have to do it. And now my wife worked in the medical field for 10 years as a rep, and she'd seen brain surgery, spine surgery, hips, like all sorts of stuff at a military hospital being worked on. So I was like, you have the fortitude for this. I do not. And so she stayed and watched him set the brake. But she's like, yeah, I don't ever want to watch that again either. Because when it's your own kid, it's you don't disassociate. You live that. So
okay, it's painful. Hey, listen, in case I forget, if you don't watch the entire Tom Brady roast, I'm now talking to the people who are listening, at least listen to Nikki Glazer, Tony Hinchcliffe, and Sam J. They were particularly funny.
Yes, Nikki was.
Yeah.
Wow.
She was just hilarious. Her cadence is almost perfect for that stuff. Really fantastic. Anyway, and to Tom Brady, who's now saying this didn't go the way he expected it to, or whatever bullshit he's talking about right now. Like, stop it, man. What'd you think was going to happen?
Oh, yeah. He didn't go to the after party. I'm like, are you surprised? I mean,
no, that I don't. I wouldn't go to the after party. He looked dazed at points. And with that plastic surgery, what I'm assuming is plastic surgery, he looked a little extra crazy at some points. But no, I thought those three comedians were hilarious. So if you're looking for an insight into what I think is funny in a roast situation, those three got me. Maybe Andrew Schultz, but I thought his cadence wasn't great. But I liked a lot of his content. Anyway, not the point. Brian, we've done a thing today that I think of as masterful. I asked you one question and we talked for an hour and 15 minutes.
Oh, look at that.
That's perfect. There's other questions on here. You, on your list here, said family reactions, which I think took us through a great story. You did talk about your therapy. Letting go, illusion of control. You got to that. You talked about community a little bit and how to support people and what they need in those situations. Maybe we did okay, actually.
Well, there's one thing I would add about the community part.
Go ahead.
And I think it's interesting. Prior to my son's diagnosis, I'd only known one person prior to that. A good friend of mine, his wife was diagnosed late in life, and that's kind of all I knew. And she lived a perfectly normal life and didn't think anything of it. Mm-hmm. One of the things that really helped me was finding people to talk to quickly. But one gentleman in particular did something great for me. And this is what I think everybody might need, which is he kind of represented what I envisioned my son to be. And it's not unlike the story you had recently with another one of your guests, that when she was diagnosed at 12 and she found herself later on with someone else in the ER with her, said, oh, and you're perfectly normal. Like I kind of needed that experience. So a good friend of mine introduced me to one of his best friends growing up. And he's like, oh, your son has type 1. Don't worry about it. I'm like, what are you talking about, John? And he said, well, you got to meet this guy, Tommy. I said, why? He goes, well, he was my best friend growing up. We did the JDRF1 walks together. We went to college together. We played sports together. He's got a family, he's kids. He lives down the street. So I went and met him. And we had an 1.5 hour long conversation. And he did everything absolutely normal and nothing unusual about any of it. And he showed me off his Omnipod. And he said, Brian, I've been dealing with this for, 28 years. And, I just got the Omnipod 5. For me, this is about as close to a cure as I think I'll ever really need because, hey, it helps minimize the risk for me, but I've gotten really good at this. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. Great technology. And at the end of the night, as we were walking out of the restaurant, he turns and looked at me and goes, I know what you need. What's that? He goes, you want a hug, don't you? And I said, yeah, I do. And I looked at him and I said, I have to look at you and say, that's what my son is capable of being and doing, is his own grown man with his own family. And this won't prevent any of that. Like I needed to see that in the flesh for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And it still gets me. And you say it on your podcast too, right? You will meet somebody. And I got a chance to see that as an embodiment in the flesh. And so for me, that community sense of, and I still talk with Tommy on occasion. He's always asking how things are going. So it doesn't need to be this constant everyday thing, but there will be somebody you may meet that just, if you can, make them your spirit animal. That's what I call them anyway. And I joke about it because they can be, for me anyway, the reflection of my future son, right? In that respect, or future daughter, if someone doesn't have a son that's diagnosed, right? And it doesn't have to be massive or impactful in that way. But for me, it was almost freeing. Like I don't have to think of my son as challenged or limited in any way. And here's a person that I can relate to like that. So yeah. That's what it meant to me.
So much of this path is having something that you can look to as aspirational. Really important to have hope and a goal that is tangible, that has been embodied by somebody else already. If that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's very, very important, because in the moment, it all does feel terrible and insurmountable, and I'm different or broken, or my kid isn't what I thought they were going to be. And then people sometimes can be inclined to give up, when they feel like the aspiration is gone now, then what's there left to do, and why would I be trying? But it's just so patently not correct. I mean, I've talked to people with significant health issues on top of type 1 diabetes who are maybe some of the happier people I've ever met in my life.
Yeah. Well, you talked to the gentleman who was blind by his kind of mismanagement, by his own admission, but got married, has a kid. He's on the forums, and I said, hey, I don't know how to contact you, but loved your episode because, my God, the outlook you have on life, that was very freeing for me. You had another woman, I think it was Gloria, same kind of thing. She's in her 70s and is like, oh, I love horses. And she just decided to kind of move off into be with horses. And it was like, so for me, it was, hey, these people aren't at all saying it's a limitation. And for a long time, the medical community always wants to treat it that way. And that hurt most was that's kind of, again, I don't say you have a dislike of it, but the approach matters, right? They don't really know how to say it genuinely, because unless they, as an endo, live with type 1, how are you really supposed to take it seriously about,
right.
When you're not living with that limitation? That's like the guy walking around talking to someone, with inability to walk, say, hey, everything will be fine. It's kind of a weird, disjointed way to try to convince me, because you don't live with this. Like, what am I supposed to do?
What made you mad about your dad's statement isn't, I think, that it was unfeeling. It's that it was unfounded. And the thing he could have offered you, I know you needed empathy in the moment, but at least that would have been honest from him. You know what I mean? It's going to be okay, from a person who doesn't really know if it's going to be okay, is infuriating. To me, it falls on the same level as God only gives these things to people who can handle it. It's anytime anyone's ever said to me, God gave Arden diabetes because they knew you'd be good at taking care of it, I want to punch them in all of their faces with all of my hands, because the inference is that there's a God, first of all, and he looked at me and said, hey, you're a thoughtful person. I'll give your kid diabetes. That doesn't make any sense to me at all. I understand the overall feeling. I get what they mean, but the way you say it is really important. Do you know what I mean?
I do.
There's another way to say something like you could pass that sentiment to me in a way that would be comforting instead of a way that's infuriating. That goes for a lot of different things. Hey, listen, I don't usually do this at the end here, but here's a PSA from me to you. If you grew up with alcoholic parents, go to therapy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Even if you don't know until later in life, for sure.
Yeah. There's so much impact that comes from alcoholic parenting onto children. And there are probably a dozen things you do with your personality that you would be much happier without. And they all stem from your parents being drinkers. And I know that most people don't believe that, but boy, man, I see it over and over again. Go to a therapist and say, hey, my parents were drunks and I need help. And a year later, you're going to feel a lot better. So that's from me to anybody who cares.
Yeah. Well, the coup de grace for me on this whole thing of kind of letting go was, I've done the big corporate America thing for a long time. I've done startups as well, all Silicon Valley kind of things. And it's been enjoyable and I've learned a ton along the way, but I never really felt like any of it was mine. It was always working for someone else's benefit. And so whether you call yourself an entrepreneur or not, you are, and you're doing it your way and the way you want to do it. And at some point you may or may not retire on it. God bless, hope you do. But that's up to you or not. I can't tell. It's up to you how far you take it. But I went so far as to say, I have money in retirement that's sitting out there. I don't know what life's going to look like in 25 years when I can finally touch it. So I liquidated it and I went on an opportunity to go buy my way into a small business or start one, because I wanted to be in the here and now. I wanted to be more present in my kid's life, but more importantly, I wanted to be able to say, hey, but that's mine. Like I work on that with passion and enjoyment like you do. I mean, I think people, if you listen enough, you clearly love what you do.
Oh, yes,
and
terrific.
It motivates people. Hardest working people I know are also the longest lived people. Not saying too much, but they love what they do. And I've stopped loving what I do, generally speaking, just being a salesperson for someone else. I said, well, let me see if I can turn this inward and do something with it. Now, I'm not telling people go liquidate your savings. There are ways to do it. I happen to have a cousin in the business that does these business startups where your retirement money is tax-free, and it sounds like a scam, but it's not. It's called rollover for business startup. It's part of the IRS tax code. But essentially, you can tap your retirement savings early, so long as you don't, quote, benefit your current self for your future self. Big unquote there with the IRS. I said, you know what? Old me would have never taken this risk. But at this point, I'm like, God, all this stuff that's happened in the last 2 years, screw it.
How old are you?
I'm 42.
Okay. Oh, it's an early in life to come to that idea. Well, I'll answer a couple things you said. My goal is to do the podcast for 10 more years. I think I can. I mean, forget I think I can. I could easily do that. It's all about if people still care to hear from me. If they care to hear from me, they'll listen. If the numbers are right, advertisers will buy ads, and then I can make a podcast. That's my goal. I hope it works that way. I'm putting my fingers in other things a little bit with AI, with diabetes and some other stuff like that I think will help people now and after I'm gone and I stop making the podcast. But my wife asked me the other day in a really serious moment. I said, hey, I'm going to go record now. And she goes, you ever get tired of it? And I was like, what? She goes, talking to people. Is it exhausting? And I was like, oh, it's the best part of my day. And she's like, really? Because my wife's pretty introverted. You wouldn't know it about her if you met her, but she's a fairly introverted person. And I think the conversating, it exhausts her a little bit. But this is the best part of my day. Getting to know you, but moreover, letting you tell your story, giving you a platform to tell your story on, and then to recognize that with a little more work, that I can share it with a bunch of other people. And then this experience that you've had listening to the podcast, somebody else gets to have it from you. This is the building. You're a building block, Brian. You know what I mean? You're a building block of the podcast. I started off going, hey, this is my story from my perspective. That the time I decided to share, I think is episode 2. Right?
Oh, it's early on.
Yeah.
I think it's single digits for sure.
That's me just sharing. Right. And then I meet a person comes on, they share their thing. We build. Today, I think I put up episode 1200 and something today. 10 years from now, my expectation is that this is already a compendium of diabetes information. And now we have the ability for these large language models to absorb the text from the podcast and actually be able to thoughtfully go through it and regurgitate it back to you in ways that are astonishing. Actually, before we go, I'll do this. Hold on a second.
By the way, I'm in the AI space, so I'm following along what you're doing. I know who you're working with.
Oh, do you really? Oh, that's crazy.
Well, I mean, I saw one of your requests early on, and I was like, oh, I know him, but connected with him on LinkedIn for a separate reason.
Oh.
But so
maybe. Well, here, let me show you this. This is fascinating.
Sure.
Who is Scott Benner?
Scott Benner is an author and diabetes advocate known for his book, Life is Short, Laundry is Eternal, Confessions of a Stay-at-Home Dad, and his podcast, Juicebox Podcast. He shares his experiences as a father of a child with type 1 diabetes and offers insights and support to the diabetes community.
Watch this. What does he say about pre-bolusing insulin?
Scott Benner often emphasizes the importance of pre-bolusing insulin on his podcast. He explains that pre-bolusing helps manage blood sugar levels more effectively by giving the insulin time to start working before eating. This approach can help prevent post-meal blood sugar spikes, making overall diabetes management smoother. Have you tried this method, or is it something you're considering for your podcast discussions?
Anyway, there's nothing you can't ask this thing that it doesn't know about what I've already said. It's fascinating.
Yeah. It's amazing to do that. I'm so glad to see you do it.
So that's OpenAI, right? The thing that I'm involved in now, I just heard from the creator last night. Here, I'll read you a text from him very quickly. The Pro Tip series has been integrated into Vision. It is really awesome. I've been testing it. Right now, the response is combine Vision's default reasoning with Juicebox knowledge. It can cite specifics if you ask for it, like say to it, which episode is this from? And even, hey, what timestamp could I find that at? It goes on, but basically, not only can you ask it to provide you with key takeaways like from an episode, but if your diabetes information is connected to the service, you can say, provide me with key takeaways from episode 1000, tailor the takeaways to my specific situation. Arden's account, which is the one I mess around with, is attached to her Night Scout. So it knows all of her bolusing and all of her settings and everything else. Like, this is insane. I was very concerned that I'd make this podcast for however long I made it, and it would have the impact on people that it had on you and your son and your family and other people like that. Then one day I just would stop making the podcast, and it would just dissipate into the air. And it would, really. Like, I know that's hard for people to think about, but if you don't make content, you don't know this. Flame on a stone. Stone stays warm while the flame's on the stone. You take the flame away, the stone gets cold, it's over, it dies. That's it. If I stop making this podcast, all the information dies with it. And so I had to try to find a way to keep it alive after I can't feed it every day, if that makes sense. So
I get it.
Yeah.
The internet is not forever. A lot of people think it is, but having worked at a large internet firm, like, at some point stuff does fade away. And based on the way the algorithms and other things work, I mean, it's a perpetual motion machine. So if you're not moving, I get that entirely.
This is thousands and tens of thousands of hours of real conversations that now we have a computer model that can pick through and then regurgitate it back to you like a human being. It's a repository at this point. So I'm trying to treat it like it's a library.
As you should.
Yeah. So anyway, that's what I'm trying to get to.
Well, the technology under that, the retrieval augmented generation, I think is what he's using in that process to limit the AI generation to just the content you created. Is stuff I work with in government all the time, where it's like, hey, like, we have 80 years of building code. We need to update it, modernize it, help people be able to query it, like builders, like, hey, what's the amount of square footage I need in order to, not have to use a bathroom or add a bathroom in a giant office setting, et cetera. Like, that conversant process with AI is getting better and better every day.
Yeah.
Well, we tell them, you don't even have to do anything crazy. Like, you can plug into existing models like LLMs from Google and ChatGPT, OpenAI. But if you generate internal, but here's the data I want you to use from and only pull from and limit the model response to what's in it, it really doesn't hallucinate very much. I think that phrase gets used a lot, but it's not trying to make stuff up at that point. It's being directed to use the content
right
that it's working off of. So it'll get better and better. I mean, I've seen some really, really wild stuff working in the space that I'm in now, where it's like, oh, that's an incredible use case. But like, teaching people how to be more empathetic caseworkers was one I was just recently involved in, where using intonation and voice modulation analysis, like, hey, do they sound as well as saying the words that actually show empathy? Like, or do we have someone who's just going through the motions?
Right.
And it's like, yeah, AI can now do that kind of stuff. Now it needs to be centered on that content, but I have really high hopes for you. And I think you're doing an amazing thing doing that, because gosh, I mean,
wait till I ask it to create a quiz that from the content that will help people broaden their understanding. And then once it creates the quiz, tell it to use the quiz to set up a course to teach the answers to the quiz. And that all happens in like a split second. Like, that's the kind of, like, wait, even the building code stuff. Wait till it gets calmed down and somebody thinks to say, hey, can you identify redundancy in this code and things that we can eliminate?
Yep.
Yeah. Boom. And then the building code gets easier to understand. Of these codes, what really doesn't have an impact on safety? And then it's stuff that people don't have the time or I'm going to say bandwidth, but I don't mean bandwidth like time. I mean bandwidth like actual intelligence to absorb the larger problem and to understand it and then spit back something. Like, people don't have the bandwidth to go through things that are that big. You're going to fix healthcare with this. You're going to fix everything by being smarter and having a bigger memory base to work with while you're juggling all of the different variables of a problem. And I'm not saying just like tell the machine to fix it, but once it gives you suggestions, then you can have human beings sit down and go, oh wow, here's the 20 years of thinking it would have taken me to get from A to B. Now we're at B. Now let's go back and be people again and reassess this. I see endless possibilities for this. So anyway, I'm super excited for it. let me say goodbye to you, because at this point I'm going to have to ask you for $100 so I can help. I can afford to edit this.
Just send it to Rob.
Yeah.
Cut all this out.
Poor Rob. Like, Rob, I'm just messing around, man. Don't feel bad. You do a great job, and you're paid very fairly. I'm not upset by how much I sent you. It's fantastic.
He does great. Your remastered series worked out so well. Like, it's not that it was bad, but like, you can tell a difference if you go back to the very beginning of your podcast, where it is now. You're like, oh, Brian, the audio quality, everything.
I'll tell you a secret. If you listen back to the last year of the podcast that Rob has edited, and then go the year back before that, you'll see there's finite little decisions and gaps and ums and things like that. I probably sound smarter today than I am because of Rob.
Well, I've noticed that there is no dead air. Yep. So kind of back to my comment about, you as a radio personality would have succeeded in the golden age of radio for sure, because you can go on. I don't want to say forever. It's not a knock, but you seem to be willing to engage with the audience constantly, which is a necessary trait in all of this. But yeah, I've noticed it even when people respond. I was like, wow, this starts to feel, not in a negative way. It was good before, but like there's another level of polish and professionalism that like, and I get this now because I hear it with your Medtronic series. I hear it with others where the Q&A, it doesn't feel disjointed. And at the same time, I almost know there was an or a pause there. I'm sure of it, but it flowed so well. So he's done a really terrific job.
He's wonderful. Let's not be too nice to him. He'll put the price up. But no,
he'll up the price.
Yeah. I can't afford that. Like, Rob, whatever insecurities you have to hold on to at least 50% of them, or I can't afford this. But no, he's really wonderful. Like, and I'll have to have him on someday to talk about his theories about how he edits the show, because it's really interesting when he tells me about it. He's made it better. He's a part of the process, and nobody would even know it. So anyway, all right, hold on, Brian. Today's episode of the Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by the Eversense 365, the 1 year wear CGM. That's one insertion a year. That's it. And here's a little bonus for you. How about there's no limit on how many friends and family you can share your data with the Eversense Now app. No limits. Eversense. Arden started using a contour meter because of its accuracy, but she continues to use it because it's durable and trustworthy. If you have diabetes, you want the Contour NextGen blood glucose meter. There's already so many decisions. Let me take this one off your plate. ContourNext.com/juicebox. Did you know if just one person in your family has type 1 diabetes, you're up to 15 times more likely to get it too? So screen it like you mean it. One blood test can spot type 1 diabetes early. Tap now, talk to a doctor, or visit screenedfortype1.com for more info. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back soon with another episode of the Juicebox Podcast. The episode you just heard was professionally edited by Wrong Way Recording. WrongWayRecording.com.